Economic Development Unit, TEDU, of UWI, to their virtual seminar tonight, their pre-budget discussion. We have three very eloquent and very learned speakers tonight. They would be Dr. Bhuindranath Tiwari, Dr. Indira Sajawan, and Dr. Roger Hussain. Our first speaker tonight is going to be Dr. Bhuindranath Tiwari, who is he's no stranger, both to national commentary as well as being part of these seminars. Now, Dr. Bhuindranath Tiwari is elected House of Representatives in 2015 as a member for currently Central 11th Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. He served in government as Minister of Planning, Economic, Social Restructuring. He also served as Pro-Vice Chancellor, Principal of St. Augustine Campus, University of the West Indies, Executive Director of the UWI Institute of Business, IOB, for 9 years before being appointed Principal of UWI St. Augustine in September 2001. They say he's retired now, but he's actually working. He recently published a book, Independence, I think it was, he continues with his publishing. Dr. Tiwari.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, Vivek, for your kind introduction and for bringing me to the forum. Thank you very much, all of you who are listening. It's a pleasure to be here again with TEDU, which has been doing remarkable work from time to time, and I'm glad to be part of it. Now, there's a pre-budget forum, and we're coming up to the budget, and everybody is anxious, not only because of what it might hold, but also because this is the first budget of a new government that has been in office for about 5 months. And what I'm going to try to do today is to answer some simple questions. One is our situation so bad that we can't get out of it? And what about other countries? Have they been in horrible situations? How have they gotten out of it? I want to ask the question, given where we are, where do we need to be headed and how will we get there? And I want to ask, are there things that we should avoid doing and what are we willing to do? I'm using the word willing because, I mean, you could know a lot of things to do, you could know the right answers, but which choice do you make? And I'm going to deal with some other things, but I think those 4 would be key. I thank you all who have joined, and I hope what I will say will make sense to you. The situation in Trinidad and Tobago in 2025 is tough financially and economically. And given the structure of our economy and our dependence on energy and our dependence on imports, we are faced with some very tough decisions if we are interested in the sustainable well-being of our country. The solution is difficult now, but I want to remind you that we have had a worse than current situation in our economic history, not so far back from now. In the 1986-1987 period, Trinidad and Tobago was in severe recession and in an economic crisis because of the collapse of oil prices in 1983, which followed 9 years of an oil boom from 1973. The GDP declined severely. The unemployment rate at that time, you would not believe, was 22%. There was a huge budget deficit as expenditure rose from 1980, well, in the 1980s, and the deficit in 1987 was 7.1% of the GDP. The forex reserves at the time was 331 million US. That was at the time less than 3 months of import cover. One of the key issues was the projected debt servicing, which would have wiped out the reserves if everything had remained the same. So just debt servicing alone, which is something that we should kind of bear in mind, would have wiped out the $331 million of reserves. This and the deficit meant that there was no liquidity. We were on the brink of financial collapse. How was the problem dealt with? Because it's important to, I can't go into a long 1 hour detail of this. I just mentioned some things so people kind of recall. The matter was approached in this way: fiscal discipline and structural adjustment. You had to do that. You had to bring the country to fiscal discipline, and you had to go into a structural adjustment program. You had to open trade and exchange, because at that time, both of them were controlled. You had to have tax reform in the energy sector, or else nobody would invest. We introduced VAT for stable non-energy revenue stream. You had to reform the financial sector. At that time, the non-banking sector was especially critical. You had to diversify, and the only way you could do that was with FDI. So you had to open up the system to FDI. And later on, beyond that, as new administrations came in, because there was a 10-year period in which there was the NAR, the PNM, the UNC. There was in our time, a devaluation of the dollar, and then in the Manning time, with Wendell Motley, a floating of the dollar. And we embarked on privatization initiatives, utility rate increases. But all of that meant that there were political consequences, and we have to remember that there was an attempted coup, but there was economic recovery. There was a 10-year period of economic recovery and growth during that period from about 1988 to about 2000, with the growth becoming sharp and meaningful in the 1990s, mid-1990s. So we have the experience of being in a bad situation and doing things that got us out. So in Trinidad and Tobago, you can't say that it can't be done. Now, have other countries found themselves in difficult circumstances? And what did they do with the challenges? And did it turn out all right? Some of them were able to come from very steep, deadly situations, you might say, for their economy and society, and get to greater prosperity. All of you would remember that there was a big crisis here between 2007 and 2009, a financial crisis, which started with the housing crisis and spread into almost everything else, and it was global in nature. During that period, I'll just mention 2 countries that had severe problems. A lot of countries had problems, and they had to do all kinds of things. But Ireland had a very severe problem, and Greece had a big problem. How did they get out of it? Ireland did bank restructuring. They got the government guaranteed all bank liabilities. They nationalized some of them. They restructured others in order to save the financial system first and then they went into a IMF program supported by the European Union, who gave them a bailout, and they started a program of fiscal austerity. They introduced significant fiscal consolidation measures, tax increases, severe spending cuts, reduction of budget deficit, internal devaluation in order to regain competitiveness, which meant that they kept wages low and they kept prices down. And I want to emphasize this word competitiveness. You see, the reason why you try to manage an economy well is because you are one of about 193 countries in the world, and everybody trying to make stuff and sell it all about and get people to come to their countries as tourists and to sell services and all kinds of things. But in order to do that, you have to compete with other countries, some of whom might be doing the same thing. So that business of competitiveness is very, very important. And if you do not address it in policy, you could spend how much money you want, it's not going to make any difference. And it is important to mention that because you need to get your economy competitive, and the things that you do financially and economically must be to serve the purpose of getting your economy competitive. Now, it took 3 years for Ireland to be back on their feet and to get out of the IMF-EU arrangement. By 2013, 2014, Ireland was on her way and the country had a robust recovery. And they started to have budget surpluses and high debt, but economic growth was good. And that meant that they could manage whatever they had to manage, whether it was debt, whether it was employment, etc. Because once you're growing and you're buoyant and you're competitive, things begin to happen. What about Greece? When the 2008 crisis came, Greece found itself in trouble. It was like Trinidad and Tobago was from 2016 to the present time, with what you might call unsustainable fiscal policies, very poor data reporting, less loss of competitiveness. They had a high debt to GDP ratio. They had large budget deficits. It was difficult for their people to live. It was difficult for the government to function with these challenges, and it was hard to engage the international markets. And people need to understand that Standard & Poor's came out with a little warning for us. They were very kind, I thought, with a little warning for us. But if you cannot engage the international markets, you cannot finance yourself as a country. So just as we need to remember competitiveness, we need to remember that you need to finance yourself as a country. And one of the ways of doing that is to engage international markets. There are other things, of course, including self-sufficiency, but the engaging international markets are important. What were the recovery steps that Greece took? They went in with the IMF, and they got the EU to help, and the European Central Bank as well. They gave them bailout packages, but they went into severe austerity measures. Cuts in the public sector, wages and pensions cuts, and significant tax increases. But one thing that you had was policy continuity. Although they changed governments, and that is another thing to remember. If you're going to do something for a country to recover, whether it's one government or several governments, once you set policy in motion and it's working, you can't come middle of the road and turn it upside down. And that was one of the reasons from 1988 in the situation of Trinidad and Tobago that we had growth from 1988, well, not growth from 1988, but the process of incentivizing growth from 1988 continued well into 2000 because there was policy continuities. And Greece also embarked on policy structural reforms, labor market, product markets, public administration. Why? Again, to boost competitiveness. When you want to raise productivity and rationalize the public service, it is not to make the public service smaller or to cut jobs. That might be part of the process, but it is to make your country competitive. It is to make it efficient. All right. It is to generate business confidence. And they also reduce the sovereign debt and they restructured the economy. Now, that program for Greece lasted about 8 years. It took a long time. But in the end, they were able to sustain their debt. They were able to raise their credit ratings and to improve their economy. They continue to have problems, but it's a viable economy today. Now, I went far afield. I went to Ireland and I went to Greece, and I could talk about South Korea, I could talk about Cyprus, but I want to go to Barbados. The main problems for Barbados was high public debt, which was a burden on them, and low foreign reserves. The difference with Barbados, though, is that their foreign reserves are replenished monthly because of the flow of tourists. But that was their problem. And they started a homegrown economic reform plan, and they brought in the IMF afterwards. They started what they called a multi-year plan focused on stability and growth. Now, that multi-year description raises the issue again of continuity, all right, consistency and continuity. And so you can't come and with a budget, you have a nice budget this year, and you feel that that is going to make a difference unless you have some kind of strategy in that budget, which then links to your next budgetary strategy and the next one, and they are all going in the same direction and with emphasis on the same things. You're not going to make any difference through budgetary intervention. So what Barbados did is they focused on fiscal and debt sustainability. They restructured both local and international debt, and they went into fiscal adjustment. They embarked on public sector reform. They told state enterprises they had to be financially viable and economically effective. And in cases where they weren't, they brought in partners and so on. They embarked on diversification and growth with tourism, which is their mainstay. And they're moving into renewable energy. They're now making a particular natural gas fuel out of sargassum, the sheep manure, and some other thing. 3 items that they brought. And of course, Barbados is a small economy with a university on its shores, and they talked about building a knowledge-based economy. And in Barbados, one other thing was important, which was social protection for the most vulnerable. But they went to IMF for support, and they started what they call Bridgetown Initiative, in which they started to articulate a position globally on reforming global development finance. So you have to do things at home, and you also have to be engaged in the international order. And you have to intuitively understand what kind of engagement is going to serve you best. And these are some of the things that you have to do. Jamaica also went to the IMF. They started with a fiscal consolidation program and a debt reduction program. I heard the Prime Minister of Jamaica today say at the United Nations that they had brought down their debt to GDP ratio to 62% from about something like 140 in the period that he has been in office. Budgetary surplus, they built that into all their budgets. Budgetary surplus of 7% of GDP minus the non-interest expenses. They set strict borrowing limits. They embarked on tax reform. They introduced a consumption tax. They reduced debt interest rates by negotiation. They went for structural reforms, public sector efficiency, no restrictions on foreign direct investment. They removed exchange controls. They stabilized the currency and tried to keep inflation down. And then they determined what are the sectors that they want to leverage. Tourism, which is a very big thing for them. Mining, because they have bauxite and other things. And manufacture, because they want to connect with the global manufacturing economy. And they went to the IMF for an extended facility, and they put their nose down to the ground, and they have made some progress. Now, I did those things to say that we have been in a worse position before, and we did not stay there. We got out of it. We got into trouble again afterwards, but it shows that it can be done. And I've shown you 2 European countries that are not at the center of things, Ireland and Greece, and 2 Caribbean countries who are very much like us, one smaller, one a little bigger, who do not have energy resources like we have, to show that they did things, make decisions, made things happen, and they are seeing a better time. They are not out of the woods yet. They are not prosperous, but they have come out of their worst season. Now, given our 63-year-old economic history and the history of the last 10 years, where should we be headed now? What do we need to do as an economy and country to get there? Now, I want to answer this question by asking some questions. Can we continue expenditure at the same levels? I think the answer to that is no, and I want to say it loud and clear. Why? Because we don't have the revenue, we don't have the money. We cannot afford it. Secondly, in the system that currently exists, there is wastage, inefficiency, and corruption. So that if you want to deal with these things, you have to make up your mind to cut and prune and begin to look at how you can get efficiencies, loss of wastage, and deal out corruption from the system. So what would it be reasonable to cut? I think that one of the easiest things to cut, it will have consequences, but I'll tell you why I think it's easy, is the state enterprises that are not making a profit or that are not managing themselves reasonably, responsibly. Because why should you subsidize a state enterprise with taxpayers' money to lose money when they should be either making a profit or making their way? So I would say state subsidies, you can decide that you're going to make a 10% cut to all of them or a 20% cut or whatever it is, and they would then have to try with a board and management to manage their business. The second thing is patronage. Patronage is a nasty little thing that haunts this country. And we saw over the CPEP debacle that we had, how horrible it is. And out of that CPEP debacle, we saw how the corruption is rooted in families, in communities, sometimes in gangs. We saw as well how the connections in a society make the corruption almost unendable. And I think that we need to have a system that is fair. And we could start by dealing with the issue of patronage, and do patronage if you have to do it on the basis of patronage with merit, on things that matter and create value in the society. The other thing is interest rates on loans. I think that that is something that is negotiable. Jamaica did that, and I think that we can also do that. I think we can rationalize social transfer. Not everybody who gets a handout in this country deserves one. And I think it would be fair to say that if that is the case, then maybe, we could rationalize it so that we reduce the burden on the taxpayer. And I want to say it's not a burden on the state. It's a burden on the taxpayer. All the state money is from the taxpayer. Now, what can we do about the revenue shortfall from energy, which can only get worse? If the price drops, it will get worse. If the production drops, it will get worse. If you have some kind of political crisis somewhere that changes the formula in the energy industry, it could get worse. You don't know. So what can we do about revenue? We can have taxes, direct and indirect. We can deal with government assets. We could rent them, we could sell them, we could lease them, we could invite investors in them. What I am saying is that there is a solution to the revenue problem, but you cannot have a solution to the revenue problem by saying that we don't have the production in oil, and we are subject to price fluctuation, and therefore we have a revenue problem. You have to make up for the deficit and the loss of revenue, and therefore you have to do something. Will it be direct or indirect taxes? Are you going to sell government assets? Are you going to rent them, lease them? You're going to put them on the stock market? What are you going to do? Are you going to bring in foreign investors? Are you going to have local consortia? What about the Forex? The Forex problem, there is no question you have to increase supply, but you also have to lower demand, right? How can you do that? You can do it by investment, especially export investment. You could do it by expanding export. You could do it by bringing in tourists with their dollars. But you can also lower demand by taxing luxury goods. If you tax luxury goods, you improve your revenue. You dampen demand for the luxury goods. Those who want to pay for it could pay for it and pay the tax. All right? So you reduce imports, all right? And therefore you create a space for the Forex. You could get it from foreign aid, reduce imports. If you reduce imports, if we produce more in food and we reduce imported food, that would make a difference. And so to a number of other items. But I think a tax on luxury goods, and you could determine what luxury goods is, whether it is a very expensive motor car, whether it is champagne, whatever it is. You could determine what that is, and you can manage a number of things because of that. Foreign exchange, demand, basically you can help to rationalize the system. Now I want to say this: reduced expenditure, higher revenue, and reduce imports will reduce the deficit. It will reduce our energy dependence, and it will reduce or import dependence. So it is not a simple matter. It's a lot of problems that you are solving there. Now, apart from fiscal consolidation, the country has to deal with diversification and make it a reality. The reason why is that is important is because we have been struggling with growth. We need to grow. We need to have good jobs, and we need to have Forex. But to do that, we must be business friendly as an economy. We must be competitive. Again, I want to mention that. And we must encourage innovation. You can't have, by the way, you can't have innovation in an uncompetitive economy. You might have some, but they will be aberrant in the system. It will not contribute to the whole. It will do something new. Technological and AI leap is required in this country. First of all, to absorb the throughput from the tertiary sector, to move our industry up the value chain. Thirdly, to integrate better with the global value chain and to create business opportunities, and also, fourthly, not to be left back in the digital divide. The Ministry for AI should work with trade planning and finance to make things happen. This would also require significant curriculum reform, transformation, and alignment at multiple levels. And you have to deal with crime. And then this crime thing, we are doing pretty well. I think the government is doing well on the issue of crime. You are seeing action. The police commissioner and the government are making a significant headway. But we are in a state of emergency. It will come to an end. What then? Effective control of gangs, guns, drugs, crime has to be put in place to govern post-state of emergency. Post-state of emergency, or all the financial action and the economic action, all the budget in the world will not yield the intended results, because that will be a constant disruptor of order and system and process and the confidence that is required to make business thrive. Now, so the question that we are doing here, we have done it before, other countries have done it. These are some of the things that we could do, right? The question is what to do now, all right? Well, I want to say it cannot be one thing or the other. It had to be this is a simultaneous equation here. You have to have defense. So in defense, you have to bring crime under control. You have to have attack. Things to do to attack the economic illnesses and not just treat the symptoms. You have to consolidate the positive action steps, not just the fiscal issue, but the integration of mutually supporting economic strategies and policies. We have to learn. We have to learn from other countries. We have to learn from ourselves. Those other countries could come from outside, from the region, but we have to learn, and we have to keep learning, and go with it. You know, we have to make choices and act for recovery and growth. You cannot get anywhere without making choices. Not making choices is a choice. Making bad choices is a choice. Making wrong choices is a choice. So you have to make some right choices. And you have to have consistency to achieve anything. So you cannot think one budget. You have to think of multiple budgets in a strategic set of action leading to a result that satisfies some kind of vision. So you have to have consistency, and you have to have continuity over time and over administrations.
5 minutes, Dr. Tony.
Now, what are some of the things that we should not avoid doing? And what are we willing to do to save ourselves? Because saving ourselves, saving our country, getting our economy to do better, creating the right conditions to have a viable future is what is at stake here. What are we willing to do? The first thing I would say is don't spend time and energy just criticizing the PNM and call Imbert only. You could criticize them, that's part of the politics. Politics requires that. But you mustn't focus your time and energy on that. You know, that is a percentage of your time. Most of the percentage of your time should be spent on good governance and developing the country. You should not hem and haw and talk about the difficult challenge and then do nothing. And you must not do a populist budget that basically takes the country further down the road to hell. The country cannot afford it. And you cannot devalue just so as a single measure. Devaluation requires a series of inter-impacting measures that should be well thought out and put into place before you devalue or float. And what to do? Well, we have to learn from the other countries. We have to learn from ourselves. And we have to see what others have done and what has been successful. You cannot avoid fiscal discipline and some structural adjustment. And you can't avoid policy consistency and a multi-year plan. You need to have that. It can't be one budget. It's one budget of a series. Secondly, the financial consolidation, the fiscal consolidation is important. Over time, you know, you do certain things and you begin to make them cohere. Taxation and other revenue measures, we have to have some revenue measures. Where are you going to get the money that energy is not providing? I saw that the Standard & Poor's report, they say that the government is going to get the money from the same sources that the PNM used for all the years, the HSF and borrowing and so on. I mean, you have to make up your mind about revenue. For expenditure, you have to have expenditure cuts. You can deal with state enterprises. You could deal with interest rate. You could deal with rationalization of transfers. And you must insist on state enterprise performance and financial viability and economic effectiveness. Make a cut in the state enterprises. Force them to function as a business. A business is an entity that is competitive, all right, and that is efficient and generates a profit. And if you can't generate a profit, well, you have to find a way of having a business model that offers the country some kind of value for viability. We have to have investment, diversification, exports, and we have to keep wages and prices down. Those are very hard things. There are commitments already made to the unions. I suppose those will have to be honored in some way. But once we honor those promises and so on, we have to have a fiscal plan, and we have to have a strategy that takes that fiscal plan into account that would keep the country in some manageable situation that could eventually get us to a point where we could have a surplus in the budget and where we can use that surplus to invest in things that are not only productive, but value adding in the system. We need to deal with the issue of competitiveness, efficiency, and business confidence, and technology and innovation. All of these things go together, and they have to be both in the private sector and the public sector together, or else you can't compete in the world. It's just not possible. You could talk how much you want. It's not going to be done. And then you need the consistency and continuity. You can't have policy going one way this way, and then you have an aberration, all right, the next way, which gives the wrong signals. It's going to cause a problem. We have to make up our mind what we're doing. Now, the Standard & Poor's report tells us important things, because I think the most important thing really is what they say about the matters related to the next 6 to 24 months. It is not just that they downgrade us, that they put us in negative and say that we could possibly downgrade 1 out of 3, etc., etc. But they talk about important, our data is in shambles. I was surprised that they talk about moderate debt. I think the debt is quite high. And I was quite surprised to see them say that the government is going to use the same borrowing from the HSF reserves, etc., in order to meet the requirements for expenditure deficit, etc. But I want to say that they raised some important questions, and they really have given the country some guidance and a chance. And many of the things that I mentioned there, the 8 things that I said, that we have to make choices about what are we going to do about these things, state enterprises, transfers, taxation, etc. Those things are important to make choices and decisions about. And if we don't make them, well, not only are we going to have to pay the consequences for Standard & Poor's, which is to downgrade, that would be bad enough. But I think the truth is that the country will be going nowhere if we are not making any decisions that make a difference. Now, how do we assess the psychological mood of the country? Can we make those decisions? What is going on in people's heads? Why is that important? I think that the PNM is seen today as having squandered a 10-year opportunity and betrayed the country. They are viewed as having taken the country to a bad place in a callous way. High crime, injudicious foreign policy, poor financial and economic management, a significant amount of selfishness and corruption, and bad governance. It is because of these things that they are out of office. People supported the UNC to win the election, to get out of the stranglehold of the PNM so that they could breathe. They know the economic and financial situation is bad, but they want solutions, action solutions, and they want fairness and compassion, and for a government to understand what it is doing and render that clearly to the population. And if the government does that properly, all right, and I emphasize properly, if it does it properly, you know, people are willing to give them a little chance to see what will be different, what will be better. They know things are tough. They do not want cheap politics. They want good governance for a change. The budget will be a signal of whether change is going to happen and whether the government is willing to make the needed shifts. And what is needed, what can actually be done? If we did some of the things, would it make a difference? Yes, it would. If you started to generate revenue, if you started to diversify, if you brought in investment, if you began to deal with the labor market, if you started reforms in the curriculum that are tied to the investments that you are bringing in, you are exporting more, you're bringing in more tourists, it will make a difference. But if you do nothing different, then nothing different will happen. And nothing different is really marking time on a death wish. Now, will there be a cost for the decision? Of course, there might be some fallout. But will there be, if you postpone all of this decision, will there be a cost? Yes, for the whole country. You know? So one is a calculated party political choice about election behavior. And the other one is a choice for national well-being. And I think that we ought as citizens to tell the government that we've reached a stage where we want a government to make a choice for the long-term well-being of our country. And I feel that that will be an important choice for Trinidad and Tobago. And the budget could signal that, look, we are headed there. We are headed on a path of recovery, jobs, and growth, that we are headed on a path of diversification, that we are headed out of dependence on energy, that we are headed out of dependence on imports, that we are going to be producers, that we are going to be makers of things and making things happen, and that we are going to engage the world in such a way that we are going to find our path to sustainability with a higher GDP, a higher per capita GDP, but also with sustainability with all these natural assets that we have. But in order to do that, we have to be able to breathe, and people have to see hope, and people have to see themselves as having a space and an opportunity, and people have to see something being done that is going to make a difference and in which there's going to be consistency and continuity. So those are some of the things that I have to say as a pre-budget intervention. I think this budget is a very important budget, coming at the time that it is and coming at the point that it is in our economic history and in our economic condition, and with the world actually transforming at a pace that is almost unimaginable. And I feel that we've reached the decision point for Trinidad and Tobago that will determine almost everything. Because I think if we were to make a mistake this time, after people have repudiated the last 10 years of governance in the way that they do, if we were to make a mistake that would lead to that same kind of repudiation 5 years or 10 years from now, I think what we are going to be doing is really creating the conditions in which people in Trinidad and Tobago, and certainly the younger people, are going to ask the political party system to dissolve itself, because it cannot produce the governance that is required to take a country to sustainability and well-being. Thank you very much for listening, David.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tiwari. I'd like to say it's quite impressive that you went to the past economic history of so many countries. I think, you know, in your discourse there, coming through it, is that of hope. The fact that, you know, we're not alone, and where we are is not, you know, is not singular just to ourselves. You also spoke quite a bit about past, you know, past economic policies and history. A lot of that, you know, ironically enough, is contained in your most recent book, 6 Years of Independence, Achievements, Challenges, and the Road Ahead for Trinidad and Tobago, which I would suggest, you know, people get, as it's full of, you know, not only essays by yourself, but by many contributors, that gives us an idea of where Trinidad was and you know, the road ahead for us all. I'd also like to add quickly that, you know, some of the things that you spoke about, and one of them was alleviating poverty. And you know, I remember when you were in office at the time, there was the growth pole, you know, there was a policy with growth poles, and, you know, establishing where the growth poles are. And the growth poles were meant to be at that time, particularly in rural areas and areas that, you know, the population was of a lower economic category. And since that time, there really hasn't been any particular policy, overarching policy, as it were, in terms of development that brings other resources into it, to deal with, you know, building up these areas, or these growth pole areas that were before identified by you, and doing it in a way that is sustainable and for the benefit of the community as a whole. I'd now like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Indira Sajawan, who we've seen very recently on the newspapers, a lot on the media. She's a competitiveness and trade economist and thought leader with a passion for driving sustainable economic transformation in the Caribbean. She has held leadership roles across public, private, and academic sectors, championing evidence-based policy making and inclusive development. Indira is widely recognized for insightful commentary on non-energy economic diversification, governance, and social equity. And she's a sought-after speaker on regional development issues. Dr. Indira Sajuma.
A very pleasant good night to everyone. Thank you very much, Vivek, for that introduction. I am going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint. So there we go. There we go. And yeah, there we go. So I am also going to set a timer in the interest of time. There we go. Yeah, so I am joining this panel in context of the upcoming budget, and it's always a good time for us to kind of take stock and try to send some signals in terms of where we believe the budget should go. A budget is a very important tool of any government's economic policy. It is not just an accounting exercise where we hear about revenue and expenditure, but it really is, as Dr. Tiwari says, it is a strategy document. It's supposed to be a strategy document, and there really should be consistency from one budget to our next in terms of strategy. One, the first strategy in this instance, new government laying out its strategy, and by the time the next budget comes, we should hear that government, telling us what it achieved against the strategy and how it is taking that going forward. So I'm in total agreement with Dr. Tiwari when he says what is required is policy consistency, multi-year strategy, implementation consistency. I want to add to set targets, which I think kind of encompasses much of what he said. If I could summarize this in terms of what we need in this moment in time going forward. I want to also say that I find it very vexing where this economy, Trinidad and Tobago, is. We really should have been in a much, much better place. When you consider the amount of money that has passed through successive governments, we should be not only in conceptually the mecca of the region, but we really should be where, employment generation should not be a problem. Forex should not be a problem. Growth should not be a problem, because we would have recognized very early, as other economies have done, just like Dr. Tiwari has cited, what other economies in terms of their tragedies and how they've come out of it. There are so many examples of other countries with this resource of oil and gas, and chose a different pathway to ensure that it didn't arrive to this place where we are today, where our dependence on this hydrocarbon sector remains so strong to our detriment, and we seem to not be able to move away from that. In my view, this particular budget it is the first of this administration. It's a new administration, and therefore we need to listen and hear what the new government has to say in terms of the way forward. But if I were to make a suggestion to the Minister of Finance, I would say that this budget should be about repositioning the growth trajectory of Trinidad and Tobago towards non-energy diversification. And now, many of you who listen to me, I'm a broken record, and this is now over 25 years that I have been saying we need life after oil and gas. And if we had started to do this 25 years or even 10 years ago, if the former administration has started it, cluster theory tells us it takes about 10 years to start a new industry from scratch. For it to arrive at some level of sustainability, we would have been in a much better place, but we didn't. And therefore, here we are now, and looking forward, where do we have to go? So I think I'm pulling out one element from all that Dr. Tiwari has said, and I'm going to focus in on the issue of non-energy diversification and what I believe this budget needs to see with respect to that. Now, the current context, I think we all know it, economic stagnation from a GDP growth perspective, decline in energy production. We've contracted, about we are just producing a little over 60% of what our capacity, what our needs are, what the demand is, so that we have a lot of idle capacity. It has impacted our foreign exchange and our revenue, and etc. There's fiscal pressure. We know our current debt situation is about 84% of GDP. The private sector is faced with many constraints. We keep hearing it over and over. The ease of doing business is a problem. Issues with respect to clearing goods at port, access to foreign exchange, all of these multiple things combined to say that the current context is a very difficult one. So again, for the nth number of time, I'm saying diversification is not an option. It is an urgent economic imperative. And what I'm looking for is to hear this budget speak to that strategy. And yes, we have to continue to try to monetize our whatever is left from our oil and gas. Yes, by all means, continue to do that. But as aggressively as we do that, let us equally put our efforts into the issue of non-energy diversification. I just wanted to try to touch on 4 areas. Time doesn't allow me to drill down heavily into these areas. I could if we had the time, but these to me are 4 critical areas that are no-brainers, especially the first 3: agriculture and agro-processing, manufacturing and light industry, tourism and cultural industry. To me, those 3 areas are very, very low-hanging fruit, which can help us with respect to solving some of the problems Dr. Jirai spoke about, generating revenue, generating sustainable employment opportunities, generating foreign exchange. He pointed to countries like Barbados and Jamaica, and I could add St. Vincent and Grenada. Post-COVID, most of these economies, their tourism sector, and by now I'm sure it has surpassed pre-COVID levels, and there is no foreign exchange shortages in this particular economy. They are doing quite well. Yes, they're much, much smaller than us. Their demand structures are very different, but this is the reality. So that I believe that we have in place, and I believe very strongly in the notion of cluster theory, which says that the private sector is the engine of growth, but not the private sector firm by firm, but the private sector through agglomeration of firms that are in the business of producing same or a similar product for the purpose of ensuring we can produce a scale that can justify the volumes that are required to meet the export market. I feel I for sure that Dr. Hussein, Professor Hussein, is going to talk about the capacity of the Caribbean to continue to absorb our export products, and I therefore will leave that to him. But again, this is a market we have not yet exhausted. But beyond that, there are also other markets we need to focus on. So let us just briefly talk about, say, why agriculture? It really is a no-brainer. We import $7 billion in food. For Christ's sake, so we have a manufacturing industry. The agro-processing element of the manufacturing sector is the fastest growing. So we have the capacity. What aren't we doing is the question that we need to answer in terms of expanding and growing that sector significantly. For example, I could tell you, I believe there is an absence of backward linkages in terms of the value chain, where the raw production is linked into the processing. And so that to me is an area that we need to focus on, recognize that we can't do everything. So we need to identify those things that we have the greatest capacity to add value, to manufacture, and to sell products that we have added value in niche markets in the global space or in the regional space that can earn us much needed revenue, foreign exchange, etc. So cutting this import bill is an important issue. And I think in the budget, the minister should actually set a target in terms of by how much he would like to bring down the food import bill by a certain time, so that we can actually measure in it. And why is food and agriculture important? Because the global demand for tropical and processed food is growing globally and will continue to grow. It's projected to grow between 3 to 6% annually going forward in the medium term. So there are good reasons to focus on what we can do really well. You know, I belabor some of these points, and I want to manage time carefully. But things like, we have the capacity that I have noticed to produce fresh mushrooms, which we import. A variety of mushrooms that I understand individual farmers are doing within closed environment. Imagine if they had the support, the kind of support that I have put here, that I'd like to see in the budget, to support these niche areas. Because on the supermarket shelf, you can't tell the difference between the fresh mushroom and the imported fresh mushroom. the price, it's price competitive. It look and packaging, it's extremely competitive. That's just one example. I could give you some more. We could talk about honey, we could talk about cocoa, we could talk about many superfoods that we have the capacity to be able to produce. And this will assist us in terms of rural employment creation, enhance resilience, increase forex, reduce domestic vulnerability, reduce the economy to imported shocks, because food inflation is a major element of what pushes our prices up. And at the end of the day, we have to, to secure person. So I'm not going to go in, I can make this available to you. You could read in terms of some of the suggestions I've made for the budget. Manufacturing and light industry, I think, is another no-brainer. We already have quite a thriving manufacturing sector, and cutting-edge manufacturing Trinidad and Tobago has. I had the opportunity to visit Blue Waters and SM Jalil, and the technology that they use is in the area of what we call mechatronics, which is a new field, and it's cutting edge, absolutely cutting edge. So we have the know-how, we have the capacity. What I believe we need to do is we need to bring these sectors by clusters. We need to bring them table. Now government needs to bring them around the table, brainstorm with them in terms of what do you need government to do and what do you need to do in order to be able to shift the contribution of this sector from where it is now. It's at about 10% of GDP. How can we increase it? It is also worth noting that in the first quarter of 2025, the non-energy sector contracted, as did the energy sector quite significantly. But the contraction came not from the contraction came from the place that we don't want it, from the manufacturing sector. We need to focus in manufacturing into the tradable sectors, where what we are doing to sell to the rest of the world. And that is the area that we need to bring to the table, and we need to work with aggressively in terms of solving the problem Dr. Tiwari spoke about in shortest possible time in terms of the revenue generation and shoring up of our supply of forex. So that is light manufacturing, tourism, and cultural industry. Again, it's a no-brainer. If we just take Tobago alone, Tobago is just a little bit bigger than Grenada. Tobago is it 300 kilometers squared, while Grenada is 344 kilometers squared. Grenada has twice the population of Tobago, but Grenada, just pre-COVID, their visitor arrivals was 547,000 compared to 126 coming into Tobago. So it speaks to what the potential is, and we know the potential of Tobago. It's about getting the product right. It is about fixing problems such as airlift, marketing, and we can't market unless we get the product right. So, the traditional and some new areas in terms of ecotourism, etc. Tobago is a just natural fit for us, prioritizing and getting it on its way to being able to generate foreign exchange. And this particular foreign exchange, it comes into tourism. It flows throughout the country. It starts from the very get-go, from the taxi driver who picks up the tourists, to the hotels, to the places they will shop and they will buy food and they will buy their souvenirs, etc. This is where, and this is how our neighboring economies have been able to weather the storm of the geopolitics and all of the external forces that are mitigating against us, a small island, very vulnerable state. So tourism, to me, again, a no-brainer. When you look at the global trend, tourism is anticipated to grow by 7.07% up to 2038. The growth trajectory is positive and growing, because none of what we do must be done because somebody likes somebody. So somebody friend bring them a project. Somebody go to a minister and say, Minister, I just have this project. And minister, well, you're my friend and I will support it. We can't do that anymore. The projects, the development of these sectors must be market driven. We must be sure that there is going to be demand for where we are going to be creating the enabling environment. We have to make sure there is demand for where we are encouraging our private sector to make investment, so that when they make the investment, we know that their rooms will be filled, or whatever product they are creating, there will be the demand for it. So that a market-driven approach to non-energy diversification is a must. I speak repeatedly about the yachting industry. All the yachting industry needs is for government to remove the bureaucratic impediments to that industry, and almost immediately we will see the number of boats coming in increasing, coming here to spend 6 months at a time. Imagine the spend they will spend in foreign dollars over that period of time. Takes 15 forms for a yacht to come into our waters compared to one harmonized form to go into any one of the islands around us. And we have so much comparative and competitive advantages to encourage the growth of a yachting sector. About 2011, this sector generated over 20 million US dollars in revenue. Today, it is probably about a third or even less of that, because poor government policy has destroyed this particular industry that is simply just waiting for the opportunity to be able to go again. I have my 15 minutes is up here, so I will very quickly, I would say the fourth area, digital and knowledge economy. I think that is important, but it is not only important as an industry in and of itself, but it is one that there is room to integrate throughout. So if we take agriculture, for example, smart agriculture, environmentally sustainable agriculture is where we want to go. We're a tiny island where farms are competing, agriculture is competing with housing, etc. We need to go into technology-driven agriculture in order to be able to go where we want to go. So, I don't want to, I want to make sure there's time for Roger. And so that at the end of the day, non-energy diversification, in my view, is the pathway to sustainable resilience and economic. I say this repeatedly. The energy sector, in its heyday, employed only 3% of our labor force. The agricultural sector at death's door employs more than that. So that in itself tells you, if we were to really put effort into these sectors, our capacity to generate employment, revenue, foreign exchange, etc., could be quite significant. And that's my end. I thought I had one final slide. There it is. Yeah. So in conclusion, non-energy export diversification is the pathway to sustainable, resilient economic growth for Trinidad and Tobago. The 2025 budget should explicitly prioritize the non-energy exports. It should allocate resources and incentives for manufacturing, the digital, agro-processing, and tourism export. It should integrate environmental sustainability, and it should leverage global market trends to maximize foreign exchange earning. This strategic pivot will allow Trinidad and Tobago to transition from an energy-dependent economy to a diversified, export-driven, and resilient growth model. This is my expectation of this budget. I have no quarrel with this budget having a very significant deficit. I am not, I think it is what we use the deficit to do that is going to make the difference. So that I will give the government that opportunity to run a significant deficit, but it is what happens in the next year to ensure that by the time we come to read in the next budget, we are correcting, or we are certainly on our way to announcing that we are correcting our fiscal imbalances. That to me will be the measure as to whether this government is on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Indira. A lot of what you said is so pertinent and I think so important that I really hope that a lot of those ideas we do see in the upcoming budget. I'd like to move on quickly now to no stranger, obviously, to these seminars. Professor Roger Hussain, who we all know as a senior lecturer and coordinator of the Trade and Economic Development Unit at the Department of Economics, University of West Indies. His research in the last few years have included topical, local, macroeconomic issues of public spending, budgeting, fiscal responsibility. He's worked with very large organizations, the CARICOM Secretariat, Caribbean Development Bank, the Office of Trade Negotiations, formerly Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery, the Pan American Health Organization, we know as PAHO, the International Labour Organization, the World Trade Organization, WTO, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and UNECLAC and UNDP. He's also worked with most of the multinational energy companies, including BP, TT, BG, TT, Repsol, Atlantic, Talisman, and Centrica. He's written 10 books, either directly or with co-authors, and has published over 60 peer-reviewed papers and chapters. His current research interests are in building non-energy exports in TT, immigration economics, and the role of large developing economies such as China, India, and in the Caribbean. So, Professor Roger Hussain.
Thank you very much, Vivek, for the introduction. I would start off my presentation with my concluding slide. As you know, the budget comes out with, as part of a national plan, as part of a bigger picture, and the budget is just one step in the process of meeting that planning objective. Now, in the interest of time, I will summarize what I see as the 3 target variables for the government. I would actually put the second point first. If we could find a way to sustainably increase the labor force participation rate from 54.8% to 70% and maintain the same unemployment rate we have now, I think a lot of our problems will be done. So I hope in the budget and less so in the budget and more so in the medium-term plan, but they go hand in hand to see that particular matter attended to. The second thing I would like to see in the budget linked to the medium-term plan is a target strategy to reduce the non-energy fiscal balance to less than 5 billion. In other words, we need to bring this country as close as possible to running on non-energy revenues. And the third thing is a strategy to expand non-energy foreign exchange. And that means a movement. I know quite a few of the graduate students so on. That really means a movement from a point such as E in the production possibility space to a point such as F, where you decrease non-tradable sector production and increase tradable sector production. So you change the ratio of output to one that facilitates more sustainable employment and more foreign exchange generation. So it's I would stop at those 2 slides, and I would answer any question that may come up in the question and answer session. I have quite a few slides here, but I would include them as we go along in the interest of time. So I would just emphasize this aspect of the budget in the context of the budget being a stepping stone part of the medium-term plan. I would say to the government, focus strategically on improving that labor force participation rate. It is the bailout variable. Focus on improving non-energy foreign exchange and in geographical terms, moving the economy from point E to point F on the production possibility curve as illustrated here. And thirdly, significantly working towards reducing the non-energy fiscal balance to less than $5 billion, some of the things of which Dr. Tiwari mentioned in his presentation. So it's already 8:15, Vivek, so I would stop there and answer as needed via the question and answer stats.
Okay, perfect. At this point, we'll go on to some of the questions that we're seeing here. So I'd like some of the first questions came for Dr. Tiwari. One from Avinash Ramsubag said, Dr. Tiwari, if I remember correctly, it was actually very difficult for private citizens and companies to withdraw US out of Barbados without official approval. And I have another one from Giovanni Alvarez saying, Dr. Tiwari, given the removal of the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority and the property tax, how would you recommend the state increase revenues from a fiscal standpoint? Also follow up, should the state increase the effective tax base of the economy, given that a lot of revenue is lost because of tax avoidance and evasion. This directed to Dr. Tuar.
Yeah, the Barbados thing, yes, there are still some controls in Barbados. That is true, because foreign exchange is so critical to them, they have to do it. And that is one of the reasons too, they don't want to interfere with the price of the dollar. But I mean, they manage it fairly well. I don't think it has become a political issue there. As I said, they have the means of replenishment as long as the tourists flow to the island. The second one, what was the second question was on Barbados too?
The second one was given the removal of the TTRA and the property tax.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, well, I mean, quite frankly, I think people feel comfortable paying some kind of land tax or home tax. And I know that the UNC was opposed to the property tax, and you don't have to call it property tax, but you need to I mean, there's nothing that prevents them from having a modest tax on properties that could generate on home ownership, if you want to call it that, or property ownership or whatever, in which you can generate some revenue. I mentioned the multiple intention tax of taxing on luxuries, not just for the taxation reason or the revenue reason, but for other reasons, like Forex and Forex savings, import reduction, changing consumer patterns, etc. I don't think the government would favor, I don't know if they would favor a consumption tax, but you could manage a consumption tax in a way that you eliminate basics. In other words, you don't tax basic. It could be a non-food consumption tax, or the basics in food could be addressed with non-taxation measures, so that you give people a chance. Well, you exempt food from any kind of taxation, but I mean, they have to. I think they have to find ways of finding revenue and bringing in Forex and generating income. And I would say that you only have two ways of doing that: how to raise the revenue or how to cut the expenditure. And I think that state enterprises give you an opportunity for both. I don't think you need to sell out the state enterprise. I mean, it's not a thing to get rid of things just because you want to get rid of them. It's a way of generating revenue, but also forcing these things to be more efficient and competitive and profitable and value creating and more service oriented to the customer. So I think that there are a number of things that we could do. I don't want to recommend to the government what they should do. I think that's their choice. But what I'm saying is that measures are available, you know.
And then Giovanni Alvarez asked Dr. Tuari again, is the budget based on the model of incrementalism? And does it not tend to pursue allocative efficiency and common development plan?
No, our budgets are generally based on satisfying the constituencies you wish to satisfy. And in that sense, it's based on a notion of political constituencies and and political or partisan appeal. And I think we have to get past that, and we have to talk honestly to the population, because I think the population is past that. If you look at even the last election, you will see a lot of people stayed home.
And then we have our question for Professor Roger Hussain. What can the government do to allow the e-tech park system to operate to optimal capacity? And this is from Nirvan Babwa.
So Vivek, do you want to answer that one?
Sure, I don't mind.
Yeah.
I think the e-tech park system is incredibly important. I mean, Indira had mentioned it, particularly when it comes to diversification. Everyone seems to believe that diversification should only be for the very large companies to pursue. But the reality is that given the need for Forex, the desperate need for Forex, I must say, then it is better served if we can get SMEs to diversify from basic import and retail into light manufacturing with a basis for import substitution, and then quickly moving on to export potential. Now, Indira talks a lot about diversification, and she's 100% right in the things that she says. One of the issues, however, is that the implementation of diversification, given the facts on the ground, is often very difficult. And this is where the government comes in, because the government can say, listen, we're cash strapped, we can't really give you a set of grants, and we can't give you a set of free things. We can't give you a set of money to import your machinery or whatever. But what the government does have is, if they look and they do an audit of their resources, the government does have a lot of land that is in idle capacity. Some of that land, no doubt, could be put to agricultural use, but a large amount of that land is not. So that's where the e-tech parks had basically come in, on the basis that the government took the e-tech parks, provided a basis for people to set up like startup companies, or to diversify into manufacturing and other types of business along that line, processing, agro-processing, at a sweetheart rent, and with certain concessions as well too. That, however, ended up not really being the case. So many of the larger companies ended up taking a lot of the land there. A lot of the land were given to people providing services and not directly processing, manufacturing, or exporting. And a lot of the people over time, a lot of the businesses that were there were not keeping up with their rents, despite the fact that their rents were so low. Colin Imbert, in his last incarnation as the Minister of Finance, one of his parting gifts to us was increasing the rent from $5,000 and $8,000 to $30,000, which, fundamentally, basically, was a barrier to all SMEs that were coming in. So if the government really wants to optimize the e-tech park system, what they should do is they need to review the tenancies, first of all. They need to see where space is, because, I myself and many other people in the chambers have tried to get into the tech parks, and they were told there's absolutely no room anywhere. On one hand, and on the other hand, there tends to be room. I myself visited certain spots that were empty, and the tenants were in the process of moving out, only to get official communication saying it wasn't empty, which is strange. But anyway, we move on to the fact that we have a new administration. We really hope that the new board will look at it, and that the incentives that they can give is primarily that land as a factor production tends to be the most expensive factor production necessary to diversify in Trinidad and Tobago. And if we can reduce the cost of that, the cost of setting up your factory, the cost of owning a space, even if it is for a specific period of time, and then there is an escalating rent after a period of time. So you get like 2 years of a sweetheart rent to kind of set up and get out there, and then the sweetheart rent can continue if it is that you hit export level potential, meaning that you start to export. If you don't start to export and then you start only being local, and you only accessing the local market, then really and truly your rent should increase. What we really want to keep the incentives for is really to push people towards earning some Forex of some type by exporting either to the Caribbean or otherwise. A lot of e-tech parks, strangely enough, are not really set up for manufacturing. They say that, but then when you investigate a lot of the actual a lot of the actual shells or the warehouses don't even have 440 volts. A lot of them have, basic electricity requirements and so on. And so the idea of setting up larger machinery and thing in there tends to be difficult. So really a quick overhaul of the system, a quick review of the system, identifying, what are the gaps in order to get this thing up and running optimally for manufacturing and export, and then to look at how do we remove the barriers and bring in businesses, small and medium businesses, largely into light manufacturing, as Indira says, that can assist in both A, import substitution on some level, and B, more importantly, export oriented production.
Can I add?
Of course, Indira.
Yeah. In terms of the e-tech park, I think another important dimension should be that the park should be designated to purpose. So that you can't just have these parks and let anybody doing anything, even if it is for export going to them. So you should zone the park. So if there is, I know there's only one that is actually specified to purpose. I think that is the Moruga one that is specifically for agro-processing. But the other parks as well. So it comes back to strategy. It comes back to determining what are the areas that we could potentially manufacture for export. Because you see, if you agglomerate, so if you, for example, in a park, if you bring if all of the firms in a particular park are producing a same or a similar product, it creates the opportunities for synergies for them to work together, for them to maybe meet external demands together. It creates, it will justify labor agglomerating around that. So because if this is the area of manufacturing, if I go and I get a degree or whatever in that area, there's going to be opportunity for me here. But when we do it firm by firm, and we just allow any firm to go in anywhere, it doesn't create that the scale that is required in order to get the kind of competitiveness that we need. And I think that is a very missing link in the whole approach to the e-tech park that needs to be corrected as we move forward.
And I have a question to Indira from Anthony Gonzalez. Would a high fiscal deficit not jeopardize the credit worthiness of the country?
Absolutely. But I would say, and I mean, as the Minister of Finance, I guess it's a balancing act. So that if I were the Minister of Finance, I would run the highest possible deficit and that I can, that would not compromise that. So it is a balancing act. But I do not know that in this moment, the government has done enough work to be able to make the kinds of cuts that are being suggested by Dr. Tiwari. I certainly believe it needs some more time to be able to look and see and going forward. And it would be nice, for example, you start off saying, okay, you have this deficit, that you're going to run this deficit, but in that fiscal year, you engage in the kind of measures that are being suggested so that at the end of it, you could actually report, while we projected in the budget to have a deficit of, let's say, $6 billion, we only actually had a deficit of $4 billion because we were able to streamline state enterprises. We were able to achieve greater efficiencies within ministries. We were able to do whatever that we can. But I certainly think that in this moment, the government probably does need that room to be able to going forward. I would also like to hear, if you are running this, let's say, for example, there's going to be a drawdown from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, which most likely there will be. I would like to hear that drawdown linked directly to doing what Roger is saying, to investing to push the production possibility curve outward. It should not be that we are drawing down on the Heritage and Civilization Fund in order to support and to pay recurrent expenditure. So those are some of the things that would be, I don't have I don't know the number, I don't have it in my head, but I'm assuming that within the ministry, there's that competence to ensure that whatever figure is arrived at, it is the one that will not compromise the rating.
Is one that will not compromise?
The rating.
Okay.
Rating.
Okay. But you see, if I may add something here, Vivek. If you look at the Standard & Poor's report yesterday, yes, there's the rating problem. But the problem, the situation is so bad that unless we run this fiscal year in a manner and form that puts the economy back on a stable growth path that generates foreign exchange. Now, one of the terrible blunder that the last Minister of Finance made, in my opinion, when I look at the data, is he equated all growth with growth. Now, if you have diabetes and you're at the early stage, you could use diet and exercise, and that will get you going and keep you clear. But there comes a point in time where you may have to go on and take some tablets, and even beyond that, you may have to take insulin. And I'm saying that the Trinidad and Tobago economy growth is not equal to growth again. The growth that we want must come with the generation of foreign exchange. And that's why the comment that Indira is making and Dr. Tiwari made earlier, if we go into the HSF, which I am very hesitant to agree with, if we go into the HSF, it must be strongly tied to widening supply space that could generate foreign exchange. Other than that, we cannot take the HSF to fuel consumption. We cannot take the HSF for recurrent expenditure. The terrible error that the last Minister of Finance made is that he borrowed heavily to fuel recurrent expenditure. We have to move away from that now. And I am saying that whatever budgetary outlay the current government comes with, it's going to get scrutinized, and we are going to look at it. It's going to work if it is part of a layered approach, if it is part of a plan. It cannot be disjointed. It cannot be one-off. It has to have a sequential logic and strategy to it that is aimed at increasing the stock of reserves while simultaneously reducing external debt. All of that whilst improving the labor force participation rate. Now, that is the big monster in the room that hardly gets any attention. I can tell you, if you bring, we are at how much? We are at about 2,600 MMCF per day of gas. I am going to hypothetically say, I would have to scientifically work it out, but if I were to give a number, I would say that moving the labor force participation rate from 54.8 to 70% between now and 2030 is equivalent to moving the production of gas from about 2,600 MMCF per day to about 3,400 MMCF per day. It's a nice improvement in the conditions of economic activity. Of course, we would have to create jobs and whatnot. But the critical thing, based upon what is something that Indira said that made me want to make an intervention, is if we go into the HSF, it must be for the supply side of the economy. You know, sometimes you hear people saying, this is not marble pitch, this is not small talk. Well, we are in a time to choose moment. And there is no longer time for marble pitch or small talk. Whatever we do, we do now counts. And if this 5 years goes wrong, the low-level equilibrium trap will be so deep, it will be very, very difficult to come out of. Thank you.
If I could just add, you know, it could even be like a kind of question to Roger. Roger's okay. So you set the targets in terms, and I totally agree with you. We have to increase that labor force participation rate, but it's a chicken and egg situation, because if we don't grow the sectors to generate the jobs, then we can't do that. We can't increase the employment, right? If we remove the thing about people just not wanting to look for a job. Also, I always wondered, and I don't know if this might be something you might want to consider, to what extent the labor force participation rate is affected by the brain drain that we are suffering. And somebody had asked Vivek if that figure includes the Venezuelan labor. No, it doesn't, because that is unofficial, undocumented labor. Yeah, so it's a chicken and egg situation.
No, but that's the beauty of the question. That's why I deliberately went to the labor force participation rate almost as a single variable. Because that simultaneously has to reduce crime, improve the quality of jobs. It's a host of things that I'm saying in one variable, but that has to be one of the frontline target variables. I mean, I think in the last 10 years, you may have heard that variables mentioned in the 4,000 odd days about 5 times. And I think it should be mentioned 5 million times. That's how important I think it is.
Yeah, I mean, the labor participation thing is a key thing. And I agree with Roger, but I mean, if you work backwards from that, this is what you want to achieve. You have to ask yourself as well, what kind of labor participation? Because you want the Forex, right? So that means that you want investment that is Forex generating to create the jobs. Secondly, I mean, you want good jobs, which means that you have to address the value chain issue in the kind of investments that you attract and the markets that they bring with them. That is another key issue. And I take the point that Indira was making earlier, which is that whether it's e-tech park or any kind of park, you really have to be quite pointed in the way you cluster your industries. I don't think you could just have a park and say, this is an investment park. I mean, I don't think it works well and like that anywhere in the world. You know, people basically say this is a park in which we are dealing with AI related, or this is agro processing, or whatever it is. And you do it like that. So I think the labor participation thing is critical, and I understand what Roger is getting at, because if you deal with the labor participation rate and you deal with it properly, you're dealing with productivity, you're dealing with competitiveness, all right? You are dealing with delinking people from the welfare system because they are now into productive endeavor, and that in itself has its own cycle. Those things are very important. So I understand the value of it, but I think you can't say that as an objective without working backwards, all right? Because that is what, for a budget or for a set of budgets to get you there, he used the 2030. You have to work backwards from that and say, well, what do we need to do? And how we split that up in 4 years, you know, it really
That's
requires...
exactly what I meant. Eh?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think
That's exactly what I'm hoping to achieve.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's the end game.
Move that labor force participation rate is
The end
the
game.
real work, and it is the deep work. And exactly what you are saying there, it's a whole matrix of intervention.
That's
but I
right.
think if you want to measure our output, that is I mean, we are the second lowest in the CARICOM. What nonsense is that? We need to bring that in the CARICOM. We need to bring that variable up, the labor force participation rate. So you are correct. And that's exactly what I'm hoping to achieve by suggesting that as one of the principal target variables.
Yeah.
So I just want to make one point because of the point that Indira made. If you know, I don't have a problem with a deficit in the first year of the government's budget. This is their first budget. And I agree with the Prime Minister when she says, you know, we'll have a deficit of some kind. I don't think they could avoid it. You just don't have the revenue and so on. But I also don't agree with the idea that you have to leave everything so. Because listen, the expenditure we have now, all right, if you leave it so, it is contributing to uncompetitiveness. It is contributing to underproductivity. It is really contributing to consumption patterns. And I mean, and I think that you have to make up a mind of what are you telling the population? Now you can't go to the population and say, look, we're going to slash and burn. I think that is a terrible mistake. I don't think it's wise. I don't think it's humane. I don't think it's reasonable. But you also have to tell the population, look, we all the money that we're making, and we are getting less of it now. We just don't have it. And we have to find new ways of making it. And meanwhile, the foreign exchange is disappearing, and we're not going to be able to buy anything. All right? We have to do something. And what we need to do is to recover, grow the economy, create the jobs, create employment, generate business, out of that, create a system of prosperity, etc. But we also have to reduce the expenditure that really, is too high, too unproductive. It is not value creating. I am not saying to cut 50%, but I don't see why you can't cut 10% or 20% or whatever it is over time. And that is what will give you the productivity. That is what will give you the competitiveness. You train people as you do that. You bring the technology, you bring in the AI, etc. All of these things, and then you're right, which is that you have to infuse this technology across the board, or else we are going to be left back. We are not going to be competitive in anything. And but I feel that you also have to do that very hard but mundane task, but necessary task of cutting it.
And Dr. Squire, I don't think we different in terms of what we're saying. I am just saying that I don't think the government 5 months into the game, really now understanding what the situation is, can really say, okay, I'm going to cut this amount from state enterprises or in this moment. So I do agree with you. I think the statement of the budget should certainly signal. And in fact, I want to say the government did, from the time it came in, did send a signal that it was going to focus on eradicating the corruption, reducing the inefficiencies. That is a statement that came out very early, and it would be obviously to us to hold them to that. And so that in this budget, I would like to hear the minister says, even as I try to, hold this economy where it is, we are going to, in the shortest possible time, look at, increasing productivity and efficiencies and all of those things. I don't think we are in this disagreement. It is just that I can't see it being done in this budget. I can see it being done over the next fiscal year. I can see some of it being done. And if I were the minister, I would be happy to say, okay, I am running this big fiscal deficit, but I am going to, over the next year, focus on these things. And wouldn't it be nice, Minister of Finance, when he reads his next budget, to say, well, I budgeted a deficit of 6 billion, but it was only 4 because I was able to do A, B, C, D. I think he'd get political points for that.
All right.
Time? Roger, you're muted.
No, well, one thing I wanted to, there's one more question, one about tourism. So Rebecca says that, Trinidad is already short of 400K visitors, right? Everyone focuses on Carnival, forgetting all the other cultural diverse things that we have. But I know Professor Hussein, you've been really working on tourism and tourism models for other Caribbean islands as well. And the fact is that, what do you think about what should the government do to prioritize and strategize tourism as a major driver for Forex earnings and to get more than 400K visitors? Is it that when we look at arrivals here, we're only thinking about people coming in by plane, and we're not thinking about, as Indira had mentioned, all the yachties and stuff that could also come here if we streamline our entry system? I mean, what are the creative ways that we really need to look at to increase our arrivals here in the Trinidad, or to really, raise tourism to a higher level here to match some of our other neighbors?
Well, I mean, Vivek, it will be very difficult to answer that in 5 minutes. What I would say is that we have opportunities in Carnival. We have opportunities with sports tourism. The CPL just finished. And when you look at the CPL in Guyana, you see how full the stadium was and the opportunities there. You have opportunities in ecotourism. You have a range of opportunities. But let me flip the coin. If we were to make an entrepreneur and private sector specialist like you in charge of the Trinidad and Tobago tourism economy outlook, there would be a range of interventions you would make. Now, our target has to be 2.7 million tourists by 2040. That's the numbers I worked out. And no matter what people say about coconut, about ginger, about manatee, about all these other things, unless we can increase tourism revenues to 50% of energy revenues for the time period 2016 to 2024, as the last Prime Minister said, our cuckoo cooked. We would be in extreme trouble. Tourism is the single best opportunity to bail this country out in terms of sustainability in the medium term. Everything else is supporting players. But yes, I do believe we have a lot of the basic attributes, a lot of the factor endowment, so to say. I do believe we could get there, but what is missing is the drive. What is missing is the drive. And I think this government has a perfect opportunity in the sense not to waste this crisis. You have come into power, the economy is in shambles, you could experiment and try some things, you could blame everything on the last government, and you have a chance now to fix the economy if you get it right. Because after 1 year, in your second budget, the commentators and the technocrats will not be as forgiving as this year. So I think it's very important to talk about the budget, but if you notice, I am only 20% interested in the budget. It's more important to link the budget as part of the restorative plan. Unless we get the plan correct, of which the budget is the first step, it's possible we could be grasping. And that's how I would respond to your tourism comment.
If I could add to what Roger has said, you know how long we've been talking about things like sport tourism and medical tourism and all sorts of things? I know for a fact that Apollo, which is the mecca out of India in health tourism, came to Trinidad and was simply ignored by governments because we simply talk it, but we're not good at going beyond the talk because of the hydrocarbon rents that we were getting, and we continue to believe will come again. I want to say that at the ground level, I believe a lot is being done at the for tourism. If you take the cocoa industry, we have an indigenous based, artisanal, driven industry that has emerged out of simply private sector initiative, which if their hands are held and the government work with them, not to give them money, but to support them in terms of where it could potentially go. That is an element that we should and can focus on. Because when you consider the kinds of tourism-related product that our cocoa can be linked to, it is quite significant. There are so many, if you Google it, in terms of persons, organizing tours and all kinds of things, because they're trying to eke out a living from the system. If we were able to use that to bring the foreigners who are paying the foreign exchange, imagine the potential that could be. So to me, it's already happening on its own. And if this government could be really serious about it, and I, like Roger says, we really have to think beyond the budget in terms of how do we transform this economy. And that is where we have to focus on. Non-energy transformation is what we have to focus on. And it is about doing that, after whenever the budget is read.
See, do we have any other questions? I agree with you there 100%. Question to Dr. Tiwari. What about the importance of a tripartite stakeholder agreement for a long-term solution?
Yeah, I think all of those things can be helpful. I think bringing people together around a vision and with an understanding of a plan and the steps that need to be taken and what are the gains and losses and changes and transitions in the process are very important. And I also think, I mean, you're living in a society now in which, you know, I heard on the BBC a couple of days ago, a reporter called President Trump from the BBC, and he asked him a question which, a series of questions in which he ended up by asking him, well, do you trust so-and-so? It was in a geopolitical situation. And President Trump hesitated for a long time, and he says, I don't think I trust anybody. And he went on with that. And I think one of the things we must understand in this society is that there is really a breakdown of trust. I think the UNC did well to bring the unions into the political process in the way that they did, because there was alienation the first time, and then there was complete alienation with the PNM. So I think they did well. I think the government is seeking to bring the private sector in more than the PNM did. The PNM would deal with the private sector, but only partners in the private sector rather than private sector as an economic force, as an economic power. So I think the tripartite approach, and I think it has to be multipartite. I think we need to also bring the NGO sector in, not in the sense of all the NGOs in the world. I mean, civil society in terms of interests, because all the issues are going to come up. All the issues that we argue about are going to come up in everything. And it's important to have that kind of dialogue to build democracies, to share information, and to build confidence, and to get people to know each other, to work with each other. It's important for society. It's what they call social capital. It's a big word, you know, but social capital is how you build trust in a society and how you build mutual respect and so on. I think these things are very important.
I think that would be a really good note to end on. So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone who viewed this podcast, over 50 people, I believe. I'd also like to thank all of the presenters for taking the time to be here and for their submissions. And I'd also like to thank Rebecca and her team for, as usual, working in the background and putting this all together. So good night, everybody, and